emphasizes these issues more than I would somehow doesn't love the gospel. My background. Just want to help you understand why this is something that I've been addressing. I was raised in South Central Los Angeles, now just South LA. I don't know why they changed all that, but by a single teenage Buddhist mother. And so, yes, I was a fatherless young black man growing up in the ghetto in South LA, drug-infested, gang-infested South LA. The police who policed my neighborhood were from the famous or infamous, depending on who you're asking, Rampart Division. You don't even have to be from Los Angeles to have heard about the Rampart Division. The Rampart Division was the baddest gang in LA. They made sure we knew that. There are a number of family members of mine who have spent most of their adult life in prison. There are 2 first cousins of mine who've been gunned down in the street. So, I also think it's rather ironic that, when people listen to me talking about these issues, there are some people who have suggested that my position on these issues somehow rises out of the fact that I'm not in touch with blackness or the black experience, or I've been so privileged that somehow I just don't get it. It's especially ironic when some of these people have seen virtually nothing in the way of real oppression, who have the audacity to say such things. So that's where I come from. I come from a family of activists. Black power, black nationalism, members of my family who were part of the Nation of Islam, members of my family who were parts of other organizations, members of my family who were part of protests and the whole civil rights movement and everything else. That's where I come from. I didn't grow up with my father, but I knew my father. My father was always an advocate. He worked in the criminal justice system. He worked as a counselor in juvenile detention centers. He worked in a boys' home. My mother was a victim's advocate until she retired in San Antonio, Texas, working in the legal system there. My first 3 jobs were in group homes because of the influence of those people who raised me. So again, this is where I'm coming from on these issues. And yet, I despise cultural Marxism. Am not a social justice warrior. Reject ideas like white privilege, intersectionality, and systemic racism theory. Absolutely, unequivocally so. And not just since yesterday. I started writing about cultural Marxism in the early 2000s, somewhere around 2005, 6, 7. Blogged about it intensely in 2007 during the election because of what I saw as the incredible threat of Barack Obama, who was a massive cultural Marxist. And in my opinion, then and now, a dangerous man on a number of fronts and for a number of reasons. And so, I ended up, some of you may have seen an interview that I did on CNN before the election, talking about, some of these issues. I only got to do that one time. So Yeah, that was pretty much it. The lady said after the interview was over that, yeah, we'll have to have you back. And I knew at that moment that I would never be back on that person's show again. And so this is not something new. Why did I think it was an issue at that time? Because of a number of things. Let me give you just a few that I wrote about then and was worried about then because of the philosophy of cultural Marxism and because of this man's long history with cultural Marxism. Not only from his university days, but even his church. This man sat under an overt Marxist pastor for decades. Jeremiah Wright was an overt, he was not just a cultural Marxist, he was also a classical Marxist, okay? This man had sat under that teaching for years and years. Not only had he done that, but his position on certain issues, like, for example, his homosexual agenda, the most radically pro-homosexual politician that I had ever seen or experienced in the mainstream, his position on abortion and infanticide, which was radical, on judicial activism, hate crimes legislation. And I believed and said openly on a number of occasions that I believed this man's presidency would make race relations in America worse, not better. An article that I wrote and actually reprinted 2 years later, because I'm not big on I told you so's, but I told you so. And so, yes, this is, I don't think that I've come here this weekend suddenly talking about cultural Marxism because, now it's a trump card that can be used in this particular debate. Nearly a decade and a half now, I've been addressing this issue. So with that in mind, let's look at it. A couple of things. First, cultural Marxism and classical Marxism are two different things. And this is one of the things that makes the discussion difficult. Classical Marxism, Karl Marx was an economist, right? Classical Marxism is an economic system. We know about the bourgeois and the proletariat. We know from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. We know about the uprising of the masses. To overthrow capitalism. We know that Marx was a communist who wanted to see capitalism overthrown. He saw capitalism as oppressing the masses. He also saw religion as the opiate of the masses that allowed them to be oppressed by capitalism. So he was rabidly atheistic. And this is one of the things that makes it difficult to talk to people about cultural Marxism, right? Because classical Marxism is something that for most Christians, for most evangelicals, for real Christians, for real evangelicals who are not way out there on the fringe somewhere, just wouldn't identify with Marxism. And if we don't understand the difference between classical Marxism, this economic system, and cultural Marxism, which is very different than this in its approach, then if you just hear the word, it's like, well, how can you say that? How can you suggest that? Three main ideas. Let me give you this just to understand Marx, a summary of his salient points. Number one, he believed that history had really three stages or epochs. Number one, the ancient stage. Secondly, the feudal stage. And thirdly, the capitalist stage. He believed that he was witnessing the rise and would see eventually the fall of the capitalist stage. The second idea was the idea of class consciousness, that each one of these societal epochs contained internal contradictions. And these internal contradictions is what would lead to struggle and would eventually lead to the next phase, which led to the third idea, his idea of historical determinism, that ultimately capitalism would fall. capitalism had to fall. Why? Because the way he viewed history was a view of struggle, was a series of struggles, a series of conflicts. He was a disciple of Hegel. So this was sort of his dialectic, if you will. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? So capitalism had to fall. Workers of the world would unite and there would be a revolution. And there was, right? But not everywhere. And so toward the end of his life, and then during the life of his followers, they tried to explain and understand why it is that capitalism didn't fall. I mean, if capitalism is exploitation of the masses, and if history is all about these conflicts, and if this conflict is going to come, and if the next thing that is going to come is a post-capitalist society, then why haven't we seen this? Enter the cultural Marxists with a couple of goals. Number one, to explain why the revolution didn't occur as Marx thought it would. Marx died in 1888, by the way. So now we get into the late 1800s, the early 1900s. We get into World War I. And there are a couple of players that you need to know if you're going to understand cultural Marxism. One is a guy by the name of Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci was an Italian Marxist. Another one is not an individual, but a group of individuals, known as the Frankfurt School. Two ideas. One, Gramsci's idea of cultural hegemony. Listen to the way one sociologist puts it. Cultural hegemony refers to domination or rule maintained through ideological or cultural means. It is usually achieved through social institutions which allow those in power to strongly influence the values, norms, ideas, expectations, worldview, and behavior of the rest of society. Cultural hegemony. That's the power. By the way, this idea of cultural hegemony explains something. Have you ever wondered why women who make up more than 50% of the population are considered a minority? You ever wondered why? Because women are not seen as part of the cultural hegemony. The cultural hegemony is patriarchal. The cultural hegemony, for example, in our society is white, male, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied, native-born Americans. You know who you are. And everybody who's not that is a minority. And everybody who's not that is a victim of the cultural hegemony established by those individuals. Which means that everybody who's not that is at war with that. And everybody who is that is privileged. And the more of those boxes you tick off, the more privileged you are. Shame. Listen to this. Gramsci developed the concept of cultural hegemony in an effort to explain why the worker-led revolution that Marx predicted in the previous century had not come to pass. Central to Marx's theory of capitalism was the belief that the destruction of this economic system was built into the system itself, since capitalism is premised on the exploitation of the working class by the ruling class. Why didn't it happen? Well, because we're not dealing with economics. We're dealing with culture. Marx missed this part. Or so Gramsci would argue. He missed this part. So the revolution that comes doesn't need to be an armed revolution or a revolution of force. It needs to be a hegemonic revolution. In other words, we need to change the cultural hegemony. We need to overturn the cultural hegemony. And how do you overturn the cultural hegemony? A couple of things. For Gramsci, control the robes of society. What are the robes of society? You know, the people who wear robes. Judges. Professors. Pastors. Politicians. Leverage those positions in order to educate and mobilize the masses against the hegemonic power. Use the educational system, the political system, the judicial system in order to overturn the cultural hegemony. Does that sound at all familiar? This is how you gain power. By the way, in the meantime, how do you gain political power? You gain political power by promising various groups of people that you will advocate for them. That's how you do it. That's why you can have so many white, male, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied, native-born American politicians who present themselves as representatives of the people who are not any of those things. That's how cultural Marxism works. Well, there's another group of individuals. The Frankfurt School. And let me give you this quickly. The Frankfurt School refers to a collection of scholars. Collection of scholars in Frankfurt, Germany. These individuals who were known for developing critical theory and popularizing the dialectic method of learning by interrogating society's contradictions, and it's most closely associated with the work of a number of German philosophers during the early 20th century. They saw a couple of things that for them explained why the revolution didn't happen. And for them, part of it was the fact that people were receiving so much information through mass media. Remember, this is the early 20th century. Radio, just coming around. TV, not so much. So people weren't necessarily associating and interacting with each other like they had been in the past, but were receiving information through things like newspapers and radios and so on and so forth. So one of the main goals of the Frankfurt School was to leverage these tools in order to bring about the change in the hegemonic powers. Reduce everything to discussions of race, class, gender, sex. And notice I use both of those because sex and gender are two different things, right? Sex has to do with your biology, gender, social construct. Your gender doesn't necessarily have to match your sex. Are we aware of this? And if your gender doesn't match your sex, then you are transgender as opposed to cisgendered. For those of you who are wondering what that was, cisgendered. Cisgender just means that you're not special. The Frankfurt School was concerned with mass media and the mass media culture. Saw people becoming passive recipients of political and ideological information instead of being activists. And they believed that this explained why the revolution didn't take place. They theorized that this experience made people intellectually inactive and politically passive as they allowed mass-produced ideologies and values to wash over them and to infiltrate their consciousness. Because of what happened in World War I, they left Germany. And in 1933, they went to Switzerland, but they only stayed there for a couple of years. And in 1935, they came to New York and became affiliated with Columbia University. There's a man by the name of Balint Vazonia. I probably didn't say his name correctly. He came to the United States fleeing the Nazis in Eastern Europe, fleeing the Nazis in Hungary. And he wrote a book called America's 30 Years' War. And essentially his thesis was this. He ran away from what was happening in Europe by force, only to come to the United States and watch it happen gradually over the course of a generation.